Hi, welcome to the Pandemic Baseball Book Club. This is Lincoln Mitchell. I'm here with Dan Epstein today, and we're talking about his new book, The Capatain Me. So Dan, welcome to the Pandemic Baseball Book Club.
Thank you, Lincoln. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, well, it is great to be here virtually, of course. I read this book. I told myself it was work related, which allowed me to kind of read it during the day because I really enjoyed it, and it's the kind of thing that was almost like a guilty pleasure. Except,
I like guilty pleasures, so I take that as a high compliment.
It was much better than following the latest political crisis in the country of Georgia, which is what I do in my non-baseball world, and that was kind of stressful. So, I noticed in reading this book that you and I are both kind of dancing around the same period in baseball history and indeed in American history. And you're coming at it in a bigger picture baseball, in this case from the East Coast. I often look at it from the West Coast. You know, my writing is often on San Francisco. But I wanted to ask you, what interests you so much in this moment, both in baseball history and also in Yankees history? You're not a Yankees fan. You make a kind of backhanded insult to Yankees fans. Which those of us, I have a theory that that a lot of Yankee hatred and anti-Semitism, there's a lot of overlap. I know that's not what you're coming from, of course, but I mean, I have noticed that. But I'm interested, what made you think, why this period in the bigger picture and why this period in Yankees history?
Well, as far as, I mean, you're talking about 70s baseball specifically, and when you say period.
Absolutely.
I just think it's the most fascinating decade in baseball history. I think in terms of the characters who played, in terms of the changes in labor relations, the changes in the way players looked, both in personal grooming and in the uniforms they wore, the changes to the game that AstroTurf wrought. And I'm not an AstroTurf fan, but I am a fan of the kind of game that was played on AstroTurf. The hit and run, where it's all about, you could win many games if you had a fast lineup of guys who could make contact and who could also field the ball well, which is totally not the Yankees, and they're kind of the opposite of that. But
during this decade, they did have that.
Well, right, they didn't play on AstroTurf, but they did have, especially in the second half of the 70s, they had guys like Mickey Rivers and Willie Randolph, guys who, could, turn that hot grounder through first and second into a stand-up triple, on the right turf and against the right teams. So yeah, I just think 70s baseball, it's a bottomless well for me. I've written, this is my third book on 70s baseball. And each time I've learned so much that I just, I thought I had my head fully wrapped around it. And then I go back and I read the old newspapers and I, do the interviews, and it's just like, there's just so much that I find incredibly fascinating about this period. So I feel like I've got at least one more 70s baseball book in me after this one.
One thing that strikes me, and you really hear this with Ron Blomberg's voice in this, is it's also a period of tremendous change in the game, both on and off the field. The biggest on the field change, in addition to what you said, is, of course, the designated hitter rule.
Right.
And then as a labor relations change, I mean, if you think about it, the 1970-71 offseason would have been recognizable to a baseball executive from 1930.
Right.
The 1979-80 offseason would have been totally unrecognizable and different.
Yeah, and I actually, in my first baseball book, Big Hair and Plastic Grass, I say that in the introduction, where it's like, if you were a baseball player who went into a coma in 1969 and woke up in 1979, the game would be, it would be a serious mindfuck to, like, wait a minute, what happened? There's a designated hitter. Some of us are getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. We can control what teams we go to. We have, self-determination over our own careers. I mean, there's so much stuff that the Yankees are good again. There's all kinds of things in there where it's just, I mean, whether or not you find the 70s as fascinating as I do, or you do, I mean, one cannot deny the sheer amount of tumultuous change in that decade. And, these are changes that, for good or for ill, the game is, still impacts the game, whether it's, free agent salaries, whether it's, the
bullpen use, for example.
I'm sorry?
Bullpen use, for example.
Bullpen use, designated hitter obviously is still an issue. And as Ron says in The Captain and Me, the players didn't think the designated hitter was going to be a thing, 45 years later. They just thought it was like, oh, this experiment, they're going to try it, means, one of us can ride the bench but still hit. It wasn't like they didn't grasp the bigger picture.
And one thing that strikes me is that, and I really like that I guess that Ron, in the description of his first game as the DH, talks about Orlando Cepeda, who was almost the first DH, because my favorite baseball trivia, one of my favorite baseball trivia questions is, who's the first Gentile designated hitter? Which was Orlando Cepeda. A lot of people don't know that. But I want to kind of narrow down the book a little bit, because Ron Blomberg, for me, has always been this enigmatic figure. He was, you write an introduction, how you were first introduced to him. I think it's very similar. My first introduction to him. I have a bunch of my favorite baseball cards, and one of them is, I think, in 1975, Ron Blomberg. I don't think I ever saw him play, because by the time I was watching baseball, he was injured all the time, and then he, of course, went to the White Sox and that was the end of his career. But he's this enigmatic figure for a whole lot of reasons. And interestingly, the book is about a friendship between Ron Blomberg and Thurman Munson, who is an enigmatic figure for a whole lot of other reasons, right? And I think Blomberg, and I don't think I've never heard anyone around baseball even then say something nasty about Ron Blomberg, partially because he wasn't around that long. But Munson was, in his own way, a polarizing player, although certainly in many quarters a very, very beloved one. And I don't get involved in Hall of Fame arguments, because I don't think they matter or care, or I don't care very much.
Right there with you, yeah.
I think that if Ted Simmons is in the Hall of Fame, Thurman Munson should be there. But I wonder if you could talk about that, Blomberg as this kind of enigmatic figure, and this friendship with Thurman Munson, which is both quite beautiful, and because we know if you know anything about baseball, in the beginning where it goes, which of course very sad and very tragic.
Right. Yeah, I mean, exactly. Like I first became aware of Ron's existence in 1976 when I pulled his card out of a Topps pack, and I could see from I was just getting into baseball, and I was just learning about stats. And I could see from the stats on the back of his card, like, wow, this guy's a pretty good hitter. 302 lifetime average. That's solid. And then the first major league ball game I went to was in the spring of May '76, Yankees Tigers at Tiger Stadium. And Ron, and so I had my stack of Yankee player cards, to kind of get myself in the headspace for the game. And Ron Blomberg wasn't on the field, and he wasn't even listed in the program. And so I remember asking my dad, like, why isn't Ron Blomberg here? Is he not part of the team anymore? And my dad had no idea. But and then as I started to learn a little more about baseball, I learned that he had been this very popular figure, kind of a Yankee star of the future in the early 70s. Like, he was going to, if Bobby Mercer was going to be the next Mickey Mantle, Ron was going to be, I don't know what he was the next, if there was a specific player whose shoes he was supposed to fill, but he was supposed to be one of the guys who helped, bring a new age of glory to the Yankees. And when he came up with the Yankees for the first time in '69, this is a team that 5 years ago was still part of a dynasty. It's like this insane 1947 to '64 year stretch where like they were in the World Series 15 times. So it's
right.
Yeah, so it's like so Ron was supposed, but then they had 5 years of wandering in the desert, and Ron was supposed to be one of the guys to bring them to the promised land, and Thurman Munson was supposed to be one of the other guys too. And and obviously, growing up a baseball fan in the late 70s, I was very aware of what a great player Thurman was, and not only what a great player, but clearly what a leader he was on those Yankees teams of 76, 77, 78, where they won the American League pennant 3 years straight, won the World Series 2 years straight. And so when I started talking to Ron about working on a book project, he actually wanted to do something about the DH and the history of it. And I thought, like, well, that doesn't interest me that much. And also I didn't know that there would be much of a market for that. But then we started talking some more, and I realized, like, I didn't go into this saying, like, hey, we should do a book about you and Thurman, because I didn't realize that he and Thurman had been so close. And then once he started telling me these Thurman stories, it was like, wait a minute, you guys had this really special friendship, and it completely, and the things you're telling me completely fly in the face of all the received wisdom that I had, everything I'd heard about Thurman since I was 10 years old. Is like, he's gruff, he's mean, he's jealous of other players, he's terrible to writers. Okay, that part was true, but that there's this whole human side of him, and I always loved him as a player. I was not a Yankees fan, but it's like I just had so much respect for him as a, he just always seemed to come to play, and he was so good at what he did, and he had a great name. I mean, Thurman Munson, that's just rolls off the tongue. So talking to Ron about Thurman, it was like it opened up this whole new window into this person. And and there have been books written about Thurman. Marty Appel wrote a pretty strong bio about him about 10 years ago, and it was good, but it was still very much like, I mean, you could tell Thurman kind of kept Marty at arm's length during their relationship on the Yankees. But with Ron, he kind of opened up and revealed who he really was under that, very gruff, very stubbly exterior. And I just thought, like, yeah, people need to know about this.
I want to follow up on that, but I want to ask a specific baseball question, because you talk about this kind of transitional period, which is when most of this book takes place. The 64 dynasty is over. It's not, they haven't come back to the playoffs yet. And this is a period in Yankees history that's always kind of fascinating me, because right before the first season I probably watched with any real attention was 75.
Okay.
And but when you look back, first of all, they weren't that bad for that long. And there is this interesting nucleus, right? So you talk about the guys who are supposed to be the next generation, and it's Mel Stottlemyre, who plays well, but then he injures his arm. Right. It's Roy White, who has, there are people in the Hall of Fame who aren't as good as Roy White, to go back to a topic I don't care about. Bobby Mercer, and that's a fascinating story too, because the Mercer for Bonds trade, the next Mickey Mantle for the next Willie Mays, kind of, both teams end up doing fine because they trade them for players that work out, but right. It really changes both of their career trajectories. Munson, who ends up having a great career, and Blomberg, who gets hurt. Right. But there was an interesting nucleus there, and you kind of see that in this book, and they just can't break through until they break up the nucleus. Right.
And they're, I think that the Yankees, in this kind of fallow period, this is when they're owned by CBS, and the CBS brain trust doesn't really put a lot of effort into, clearly they know what they're doing to some degree, because they draft Thurman Munson, they draft Blomberg, who was a stud coming out of high school, and then they draft Mercer, but for whatever reason, they couldn't seem to put it together on the player development front on a big widescreen level until George Steinbrenner buys the team in '73 and installs Gabe Paul as the general manager, and then you start seeing it all kind of kicking into gear. And that's when they start, breaking up. That's when the nucleus really starts to break up. And there's that trade in 74, I think we talk about it in the book, where all of a sudden, like, half the starting pitching staff is sent to Cleveland. And this is the trade that brings Chris Chambliss and Dick Tidrow to the Yankees, both of whom will play key roles on that World Championship squad. But yeah, I mean, you're right that it is, in the grand scheme of things, like 64 to 76 is not, that's 12 years. That's not so long. But of course, well, there's two things. One, you get a city like New York that's used to having the Yankees win. 12 years seems like a long ass time, especially when there are some teams in there, like, what was it, the 66 team that actually loses over 100 games, and I mean, which the Yankees hadn't done since they were the Highlanders. I mean, this is not done. This is no one is expecting this, and then so from the New York standpoint, that's a long time. And then for somebody like you or I, who are 10, 11, 12 in the mid 70s, like, 12 years is a long time. 12 years is, that could be World War II ago. That's so sort of think like, and as I say in the book, and as I'll say to anybody, I'm not a Yankees fan, but I was fascinated with that 76 team when they were happening because, well, they had a lot of cool players. Thurman, Mickey Rivers, Oscar Gamble. I was Doc Ellis. I was really into those guys. But also it was like this sense that, like, I understood that the Yankees were historically a very important team, and then they were great again. And then there was that reflection on New York City, this city, this great city. I was born in New York. I never lived there, past age 1.5, but I always felt this connection to it and this sense that, like, this is the greatest city in America. And the greatest city in America should have, like, it's cool that they've got such a great team. And, well, at the same time, not making the leap to Yankees fandom. So this is, was for me then, and still remains, a very fascinating period to me in Yankee history. And it's part of New York history, which is something I'm also incredibly fascinated in.
I think also if you're going to have 12 years of the Yankees being kind of out of it, this is a pretty. I mean, if they'd missed the World Series area from 1951 to 1963, in terms of what's happening with America, right? The America that they lost to St. Louis to in the '64 World Series, and the one where they lost to Cincinnati 12 years later is so different.
Right.
And I think so. The 12 years feels longer.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a totally different social. It's like, yeah, exactly. Like 64, it's still civil rights marches. The war in Vietnam has just begun. 76, the war in Vietnam is over. There's a Democratic presidential candidate wins in November. There's this, sense of the country being kind of the most liberal it had ever been at that point. And so, yeah, so very, very different America.
And it's also very different. I mean, this book, what strikes me about your discussion about Thurman Munson, which I was a huge Yankees fan and a huge Thurman Munson fan. And also, as a kid, you don't have to pick a side. You can be a fan of both Reggie Jackson and Thurman Munson, right? Which I think maybe if you were adult, that was a little more complicated than that. But what strikes me about this book, and this is, something that only a teammate can do, is one, you get a sense of just how human these guys are. But also, it was a time when the culture, for better and for worse, allowed athletes to be human, right? I mean, they're doing things that you just can't fathom professional athletes doing now. I mean, in the social media, but also an age where, they were making more than your average American, but not in the kind of scales that they were today. So maybe, discuss that a little bit and how Blomberg experienced that. And,
Yeah, I mean, and this is something that I've always been fascinated with, is like the human side of baseball. And I've never have any patience uh, with fans who are like, expect constant perfection out of athletes, and like, I pay your salary and you should, that to me is like one of the most moronic aspects of fandom. And I think, so I've always been, I mean, in all the books I've written, like I'm always interested in what these guys are getting up to off the field, and not in like a scandal sheet way, but just like, what's life like? And so I really enjoyed talking to Ron about that. Just like, what would you guys do on the road? Well, we would all, usually a bunch of us would all go, find whatever the big disco was in town, and we'd all, kind of hang out, and like the black guys would dance and the white guys would like grumpily sit in the booth, and we'd nurse our cocktails, and and occasionally they'd get crazy, and somebody would do something stupid or funny or whatever, but like, it was a very kind of mundane, but also reflective of what life was like for, I mean, they were basically like upper middle class Americans. Ball players were at that point. They're making, maybe they're making 40,000 a year, which would be like 160,000 a day. And so that's a nice salary. I would like to make that, but it's not, they're not living in luxury. They're not riding limos everywhere. I mean, they're in spring training, and they're doing a ride share. Like the team has rented a handful of cars for them to just share, and the riders tag rides as well, because nobody can afford to rent cars in spring training, and they've all got their meal money, and that's it. And
Get upset when Reggie Jackson drives his own car, right?
Right, and that's a huge, that you really see, as much as like the Reggie's comments to the press, like Reggie, really balling out with his new paycheck, and setting himself apart from the team. Like, I'm not traveling on the bus. I'm driving my expensive convertible to the ballpark. And that I think more than anything gets under the skin of his teammates. But to your original point, these are guys who, by and large, have to work in the off season, and Ron kind of gets around that because he becomes good friends with Nat Tarnopol, who's a record executive who in New York, who's a huge Yankees fan, and he's Jewish, so he takes a total shine to Ron and wants to like do whatever he can to help him and make him feel welcome in New York. So he winds up like paying Ron just to like hang out at his office during the off season. Otherwise Ron would have had to like get a job selling insurance or shaking hands in an auto sales shop, sales
Big graves like Richie Hebner.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, I mean, like the Richie Hebner gravedigger thing, like that's the ultimate case of the 70s baseball player working in the off season. But but a lot of these guys like sold insurance, or they were sort of worked as kind of hospitality people for hotels. I mean, that there were a lot of different things ball players could do to make money in the off season, but the fact that they had to make money in the off season, as opposed to now where it's like, guys rarely even play winter ball anymore. It's like they're set.
And you mentioned this character, Nat Tarnopol, and I was really struck by that, and also this discussion about people working, because it's in this period a little later when Bowie Kuhn, who along with Fay Vincent were probably the two commissioners who were totally overmatched by what they were up against. And Kuhn makes, I think, a terrible decision, and just like so stupid, in banning for life, of all people, Mickey Mantle and Willie Mays. Because, the late 70s, baseball struggling to be popular. Why not band for life the two most popular living baseball players? There's a certain logic to that. But what strikes me is that this friendship with Nat Tarnopol, a few years later, if Bowie Kuhn gets wind of that, it could create problems for both Munson and Blomberg. And he talks about it. Was he how aware and how concerned about that were they? The other point I wanted to ask you was your description of life on the road. It seems, based on the book, that Ron Blomberg, I actually kind of thought this was cool. Very interested in where the best restaurant is in every town, right? That was fantastic. I had to say, I don't eat meat either, but some of his descriptions of eating food in New York, particularly Jewish food, it reminded me of coming here because I grew up in California. Like you, I was born here in New York, where I am now, and I would come see my grandparents. And this is the kind of food I would only eat with my grandfather in New York,
Totally.
He seems to be a big food guy, unless I'm misreading the book.
No. Ron is 100% a big food guy. In fact, we've had some. Because I don't eat meat, which really confuses him. But so he'll be like, but you eat chicken. I'm like, no, And so I was telling him, this is somewhat off topic, but I was telling him, I'm a big fan of Beyond Meat's Italian sausages, which are, it's all plant-based, but they're really good,
Yeah.
especially when you grill them. So I was telling Ron about this, and what, and he's like, so you just grill them and then you put them in the sauce. I was like, yeah, exactly. And then he just goes, he's just sort of overcome with this desire for Italian sausage. He's a big eater, and in fact, he gets in trouble in spring training when he's still basically a rookie, and he and several of his teammates, Thurman included, go out to an all-you-can-eat restaurant out where the Yankees are taking taking spring training rather, and they get banned from the restaurant for life because Ron literally goes back 12 times to load up on rock crab and lobster and just he to this day he's in remarkable physical shape, but I think he can really seriously put it away.
So tell me about the Tarnopol situation, though.
Okay, so
right. Was that something that what happened there?
So Tarnopol is a really interesting figure in and of himself in music history. He's a guy. He's a Jewish kid from Detroit who kind of hustles his way into a relationship with Jackie Wilson, who was one of the big R&B stars in the late 50s. And kind of through his association with Jackie, works his way up to president of Brunswick Records, which, it's Brunswick isn't a name like Motown where, everybody knows it, but if you're into soul music of the 60s and 70s, Brunswick is a big deal. Brunswick has, everybody from the Shy-Lights to Jackie Wilson was huge. Barbara Acklin, Young Holt Unlimited. They put out a lot of great soul records, and like most record guys of that era, Tarnopol was completely mobbed up. He later gets in trouble for payola, which, along with a lot of other record guys in the late 70s, but it was beyond payola. He was involved in all kinds of stuff. And Ron is naive. Ron and I think Thurman is less naive, but they both become great friends with Nat, and they hang out with him all the time. And Nat has a lot more money than they do, so he's the one always taking them out to dinner, inviting them up to pool party at his mansion. He takes care of them. If they need a TV set, he gives them TV. He buys them Mercedes Benzes. It's they're his boys. He wants to see them taken care of, and he
wants to buy the Yankees.
And he wants to buy the Yankees, and this is a problem because the owners would have to approve. I mean, not the Yankee owners, but all the major league owners would have to approve the sale of the Yankees to whoever CBS was selling to, and CBS was looking to offload the team at this point. But Nat's connectedness is well known enough that he never stood a chance of being able to buy the Yankees. And he had great plans. He was going to install Dick Williams as manager, and he knew all these people. It wasn't just Thurman and Ron. Nat knew all sorts of people in the Yankees, knew all sorts of people throughout baseball. He was a huge fan and wanted to be a franchise owner, specifically the Yankees. And at one point, CBS has clearly done their due diligence into this guy when they're looking for potential buyers, and they realize kind of who he is and who he knows. I mean, he's buddies with the Gambinos. He's got a lot of questionable income streams, and so they kind of take Ron aside and say, you should be careful hanging out with this guy, because it could and they don't lean on him to the point where it's you have to you can't be seen with him, or you can't or if you are seen with him, we'll fine you. It doesn't get that heavy, but it's like you should know more about him, and you should know what you're getting into. And this is completely this is heartbreaking to Ron, because to Ron, Nat is his friend. It's not about and he insists to this day that even though he and Thurman saw some stuff that in retrospect is kind of shady, they never talked about okay, we're going to whack this guy. They never talked about make sure so-and-so is playing this record, or we're going to break his arm. There was never any, it was there was never any drugs, done in front of Thurman and Ron. It was sort of like Thurman and Ron were with Nat and the rest of his mob pals, they were their pets, and these kind of almost exotic creatures, wow, real life Yankee heroes. And so they just kind of got off on being around these guys and didn't want to do anything that would have jeopardized their careers and jeopardized them winning games for the Yankees.
You discuss Ron in that context, and one thing that strikes me that's kind of funny about this friendship, but the two, Ron Blomberg and Thurman Munson, is that it's not how you would expect it at first glance, right? Blomberg is from the bigger city; he's Jewish,
right?
Thurman Munson's from Canton, Ohio, which is not it's a medium-sized city at best, and yet he's the one who, if any of them is a city slicker, it's him,
right?
And if anyone's a kind of less kind of city smart, it's a streetwise, if you will, it's Ron Blomberg. But what also struck me reading the book is that, and maybe it's because he gets into this more in his Designated Hebrew book, but he seems very reluctant to talk about himself. And at one point he mentions his son, at a game. And when did the son come along?
Right.
and maybe that was just a deliberate, because he wanted to focus on this friendship, or was it just he is reluctant to talk about himself?
No. He's very, but I think we both felt that he went into all that in Designated Hebrew, and I feel like there's a lot of Ron still in this book, and but I really, I wanted it to be very much try to balance it between him and Thurman, and and it's difficult because of course Thurman's been dead for 40 years, so it's pretty much just Ron telling the tale. But I really, for a while we talked about maybe getting some other player voices in, Ron is still buddies with a lot of those old Yankees, get him to tell their Thurman stories or whatever. And I thought, at first I was like, yeah, that would be great. But then the more I thought about it, it's really, that would take away from what I feel is really the emotional meat of this story, which is Ron and Thurman's friendship. And so stories from Mickey Rivers about what he and Thurman got up to sometime wouldn't, that would be cool. And I would, read that, and, maybe that would be a fun book to write sometime. But I think that the friendship that Thurman and Ron had was so special at that I really wanted to make sure it was focused on that. And that's also part of why we didn't get too much into Ron's own stuff. And we do get into his stuff a lot with, the depression he suffers, his injuries and all this, because that was, to me, was another really interesting part of this is like, we go back to talking about the human side of baseball. And, you've got these two guys, Thurman and Ron, really talented players, about the same age, come up about the same time, the Yankees. And then like, you just see like for a couple of years there, they're like on the same path. They're both, they're playing together. They're, the team isn't that great, but it seems to be improving. And like things are looking like it's a new day for the Yankees. And then Ron starts getting injured, and it's like they're on this trajectory together, and then all of a sudden Ron just like falls away. It's like like a rocket booster on launch. It's like Thurman keeps going up, and Ron just falls to the ground. And like what that does to somebody, what that and again, like if you had told me in 1976 or 77, like, yeah, there's this guy on the Yankees, he's not playing because he's injured, and Thurman is his best friend and goes and hangs out with him every day in the trainer's room and tries to psych him up and tell him that like he's coming back. It's like I wouldn't have even been able to wrap my mind around that, because that was so not part of the Thurman Munson narrative. So no, so I mean, so it's so. I was worried actually that we were getting too much Ron in there, but I thought that that it was really important to kind of examine just like how dark things got for him, and that like through it all there was Thurman. Thurman had a lot of other stuff he had to deal with. He was leading a team to the pennant. He was dealing with a pitching staff. He was dealing with Billy Martin. 77, 78, he's dealing with all the Reggie Jackson bullshit. And yet he's still...
And his family.
And yet he's still making time for Ron. He's you see all these other players that are just like kind of avoiding him, kind of like don't know what to say to him, kind of think maybe he's a bad luck charm at this point. But that's all bullshit to Thurman. Ron's his buddy. He's going to be there for him.
And if you're a baseball fan, baseball, especially if you have a sense of history, it's always this game of what ifs. What if this trade doesn't happen? What if this guy doesn't get hurt? And this is, in a very sad way, this book, I think, it's a chronicle of a friendship that is just framed by what ifs.
Right.
What if Thurman Munson doesn't get on that plane? What if Ron Blomberg doesn't get hurt? I mean, that Yankees team, it's easy. What struck me is we talked about the Chris Chambliss trade, and I'm reading that, and I saw it through his eyes, which was Chris Chambliss is there to take Ron Blomberg's job.
Right.
And I don't think he doesn't say that, but I assume he got that. So he's already kind of thinking that. But also, this is I very much agree. A bunch of Yankees talking about Thurman Munson. I mean, if you're the kind of fan who's interested enough to pick up this book, you know all those stories already, right? What you don't know is the story of this intense friendship. And that, to me, was really powerful. And also, you and I are older now than Thurman Munson was when he died, than Ron Blomberg was when he got hurt. Certainly than Ron Blomberg is now, because if he's older than us then, he's still older than us now, according to my math. So we have a different perspective. And what strikes me is these guys knew each other for about a decade.
Yeah.
A decade in the life of Ron Blomberg that is, I would assume he's 70-ish now.
Yeah, it's 72, I think.
I'm sorry?
72, I think.
So early 70s, a lifetime that's in its eighth decade. And how, and they were really stopped being together every day when he went to Chicago, and even when he started getting hurt, he couldn't travel with them. But it's clear that this is one of the kind of not formative, but intense seminal relationships in his life.
Right.
All these years later, to write this book 41 years later speaks to the depth of the relationship, but also the importance that Thurman Munson had to him for a while and still has to him now.
Yeah, well, and of course, there's the intensity of the relationships between ball players, or, maybe not now, but certainly then, I where like they're on the road together constantly. They're on, they're in each other's pockets for, 250 days out of the year, basically. And the the thing where, like, if you, I mean, there are a lot of guys who kept to themselves or whatever, but like, that if you go through this experience, and again, like we're talking the 70s, in the 70s, there wasn't the kind of player roster turnover that there is today, where it's like, it was not uncommon for guys to be on a team together for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years together. But I just think, like, that's, I mean, you think about, like, for you and I, like an experience like going to college, where it's like, it's only 4 years, but like those were 4 really intense years. And, I'm guessing you have friends from college that you're still, in touch with, or.
I'm in a weird story because I transferred halfway through.
Oh, okay.
So that kind of was a rupture. I'm actually more in touch with my Catholic school friends than my college friends.
All right, but Catholic school, that's pretty intense too. So
I went to Catholic school for 10. I went to Catholic school for 10 years. It's unusual for a Jew. Not that unusual for a Jewish San Franciscan, actually. Dianne Feinstein went to the girls' school next to my boys' school, for example.
I had a lot of Jewish friends who went to the Catholic school in Chicago, so yeah. It's like, it was a good school.
Right, it's a good school. It's a fun, but I definitely have friends who went to Catholic school in 9 or 10 years, and we're still very close today. So it can be very intense, every day, most of the time.
Yeah, and like, and those memories are kind of seared into your frontal lobe in a way that, like, things that happen 10 years later just, they're gone. And so, I mean, you think like these are guys, like, they've dreamed all their lives of playing Major League Baseball. They're playing for the Yankees, which is, an experience unto itself in terms of pressure and intensity. And they're seeing each other, every spring, year after year, and they're on the road with each other, and they're, going out to eat together and stuff. So, I mean, it's the possibility of forming a deep friendship that, will continue to echo for the rest of your life. I mean, I can definitely see why and how that could have happened.
I want to just, speaking of Jews in Catholic school, Ron Blomberg was a Jew who didn't go to Catholic school, but I want to just touch on this because, I read a lot about Jewish baseball players and their experiences, and he seems to have an experience that is totally positive. He enjoys it. He loves being taken out to eat. I mean, there's that theme again, right? He loves that Nat takes a liking to him because he's, the Jewish guy. And importantly, I think in the Ron Blomberg story, for those who don't know this, as you start in the beginning, this guy really could hit. I mean, he had power. I think his career OPS is up above 130. I mean, OPS plus. He could really hit. So he seems to, and you don't hear the stories of the anti-Semitism the way you would if you're reading about a Koufax or an Al Rosen or Hank Greenberg, or even more contemporary players.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a couple of things here. One, Ron is one of the most positive people that I've ever had the pleasure of becoming friends with. Like, he is just, like, we've spoken on the phone like nearly every day for the last year, and I would say maybe 1% of that time he's bummed out about, and it's about like stuff like the pandemic and like not being able to, run his baseball camp because of it, things like that. It's like he is just super upbeat, super positive, super, like, always sees the bright side. So I think, like, I think even back then he was kind of like happy to be there, happy to, make the connections, happy to be the Yankees' first big Jewish player, all that. And like, if there was anti-Semitism that he dealt with, it just kind of washed off his back because, like, hey, I'm playing baseball for the Yankees. What can you possibly say to hurt me? and I'm somebody's taking me out to eat, and I'm going to demolish a pile of knishes. What can you possibly come up with? So and even in his his dealings with Billy Martin, which are not pleasant, like Billy has a rap of being anti-Semitic and racist and all that, and it's like I don't get the impression that like that was ever an issue between Billy and Ron. It was just Ron couldn't play, and that was the issue for Billy.
But that really did strike me, because I know that I've spoken to people who are close to Ken Holtzman.
Yeah.
Very different take on Billy Martin. And also that he never, Holtzman and Mike Epstein of that 72 A's team were two of their best players,
Right.
So it was fascinating. He doesn't, maybe he felt like he went into it again a lot in designated Hebrew, because that was, the rap on him.
Well, and he does mention that like one of the reasons he wanted to go to New York to play for, one of the reasons New York was so appealing was that, he was not brought up in a super religious household, but they were still proud to be Jews and didn't do anything, they didn't change their names. They didn't do anything to kind of hide the fact that they were Jews living in Georgia. But he was very aware that like, there was the John Birch Society, there was the KKK, like those things were still very active in Georgia, and they were not big fans of Jews. So, but a place like New York, where it's like, this is kind of, the Jerusalem of America, it's like I can go there, and my people will be there, and I will be embraced. I mean, that was huge for him.
Yeah, and he seems to have embraced it back, right? I mean,
yeah, oh, definitely.
And
still does.
Yeah, I'm struck by maybe we could, as we wrap up here, a couple kind of related questions. One is, what's he up to now? In talking to him, kind of how much is Thurman Munson on his mind? Is it something he thinks about daily and all of that? And secondly, you mentioned how he's relentlessly upbeat, and I wonder how this experience of when he gets hurt and can't play, as someone who until that point, again, I don't, you know him a lot better than I do, but based on what I've read about Ron Blomberg, he had a pretty, like, things were breaking his way until that point. And that can be tough for people, the first real obstacle that you can't control because you're hurt and you can't do anything. No, you can't do enough about it.
Right. And talking about it back to the what ifs, it's like, I think Thurman was very conscious that like what happened to Ron could have happened to him, just like having the freak accident, on the field, pulling a muscle really badly. I mean, like these are things that, happen, and like with one swing, your career could be over and you just don't know. So I think Thurman had a lot of empathy for and understanding for Ron about that. As far as what Ron is doing now, he usually is, he's a public speaker. He does a lot of, motivational type of stuff, or like speaking to various groups, and then he runs like he usually goes down to spring training with the Yankees. He does, he's sort of I'm not sure if he's an advisor or just like a totem, but like they bring him down every year, and then he runs like a summer baseball camp in New Jersey every year for kids. But this last year he wasn't able to do any of that, which was, that was a huge, I think in some ways like that was the biggest down period in his life since that period where he, initially retired and, retired at the age of 29 from it because of injuries and had no idea what he was going to do with his life after that. It was pretty rough for him. I think he was just, working out every day and finding, ways to, I think he's gotten really involved with social media, which I think has been really helpful for him in this time, because he's a people person and he loves to connect with people. And so that's, learning how to do all that has been really good for him. And, I'm sure he thinks about Thurman every day. He thinks about the Yankees every day. He thinks about, his experience as a major league ball player every day. I mean, this is defining stuff for who he is. And I think, it's kind of interesting because, he had his kids, I think we're definitely all too young to see him play. So that's kind of like they don't have, I think any sense they have of who he was and, what this part of his life was, comes from, his ability to tell stories. I mean, clearly he loves to talk about it. But yeah, I think it was clear to me. I mean, when we started working on this book, I mean, it wasn't like I would have to dig, really prod him to come up with Thurman stories. It's like, it was always just like, and one thing would lead to another, and it would be like, wait a minute, let's hold that thought. We're still finishing this story. And so, yeah, he's Thurman left a huge mark, not just with the Yankees, but with Ron.
Well, is there anything that I should have asked you that I didn't about this book?
Oh, that's a hell of a question. No, I can't. Those were great questions, man. I think.
Thank you. This has been a great conversation. And
yeah, no, that's a lot of fun.
And again, it's the Pandemic Baseball Book Club. The book is The Capatain Me. Dan Epstein is our guest, one of the co-authors of the book. So thank you, Dan, for joining us.
My pleasure. And let me throw in the subtitle of the book, which is On and Off the Field with Thurman Munson. So yeah, this is, Ron Blomberg and I, this is very much about their friendship and their connection. And I think if you're a Yankees fan, if you're a fan of 70s baseball, if you're just a fan of good baseball stories, there is something in here for you.
I agree. And tell yourself it's work so you can read it during the day, because you won't be able to put it down.
Awesome.